So this is something that started to take shape in public the first week of December 2017, December 5th, 2017, which was a Tuesday. And that was a moment that was a little bit of a fraught moment in the federal government. Because just a few days earlier, the previous Friday, Robert Mueller had got himself his first cooperating witness when Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn pled guilty to a felony charge and signed a plea deal in which he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors from the special counsel's office. So that had happened, the first cooperating witness for Mueller. That happens on Friday. Then it was the weekend. Then Tuesday morning before dawn, a German publication called Handelsblatt, I think that's how you say it. I don't know how to speak German. Handelsblatt, that's my guess. They ran this headline, quote, Mueller's Trump-Russia investigation engulfs Deutsche. Deutsche Bank has received a subpoena from the U.S. Special Counsel investigating possible collusion between President Donald Trump's campaign and Russia. Here was the lead they ran that day, quote, Deutsche Bank has been served. U.S. investigators are demanding that it provide information on dealings linked to the Trumps, say sources familiar with the matter. The subpoena is part of a probe by special counsel Robert Mueller and his team to determine whether the president's campaign was involved in Russian efforts to influence the U.S. election. Quote, it remains unclear whether Mueller requested information on President Trump's own business dealings with Deutsche Bank or on those of people close to him. Deutsche Bank apparently received the subpoena weeks ago. So again, that news broke in the pre-dawn hours here in the U.S. on Tuesday, December 5th, 2017. German publication breaking that news. In Bob Woodward's book, Fear, he says the day that story ran in that German publication, the president called his top Russia lawyer at 7 a.m. Eastern time. Quote, he was furious. The story then spread. It was picked up by Bloomberg and by Reuters and by The Guardian and by the Wall Street Journal. They all did their own reporting to follow up that scoop from Handelsblatt. And the details were all a little different in each of those outlets and each of those stories. But the basic idea was simple. Federal prosecutors had subpoenaed the bank that held hundreds of millions of dollars in loans to President Trump, the bank that somewhat inexplicably had done hundreds of millions of dollars of business with him years after he'd been blackballed at every other major financial institution in the country, a bank that, perhaps coincidentally, was also mired in a huge ongoing scandal over its role in a multi-billion-dollar Russian money laundering scheme. Back in July of 2017, that summer, the president had said that any effort by prosecutors to look into his personal finances or his business finances would be a red line from his perspective, a line that could not be crossed. We later learned, months later, in reporting from the New York Times, that day that German newspaper broke the story of that subpoena and all those other news outlets then subsequently ran their own versions of those stories. December 5th, 2017, we learned later the president not only angrily phoned his Russia lawyer at 7 a.m. that day, he also, according to the New York Times, that day tried to mount an effort for the first time to fire Robert Mueller, to end his Russia investigation. Quote, in early December, President Trump, furious over news reports about a new round of subpoenas from the Office of Special Counsel, told advisors in no uncertain terms that Mueller's investigation had to be shut down. The president's anger was fueled by reports that the subpoenas were for obtaining information about his business dealings with Deutsche Bank. The Times cited 8 White House officials, 8, as its sources for that story. And we still don't know why exactly that subpoena, right, that investigative effort, above all else, would be the red line. That would be the thing that caused the president to move in and try to fire Robert Mueller. But by the end of the day on Tuesday, December 5th, 2017, it's interesting. Most of those stories about that subpoena to Deutsche Bank, most of those stories had been at least partially walked back or at least softened. Maybe there wasn't a subpoena at all, or maybe the subpoena was not about Trump himself. Maybe the subpoena was about people just affiliated with Trump. I mean, if there is a financial story to tell at the heart of this scandal, for a number of reasons, Deutsche Bank feels like the place you might start to try to figure that out. We've never had complete clarity on what happened with those news reports back in December 2017 and the president's reported freak out about that story in particular and why that story ultimately got at least partially here and there, walked back a little bit, at least a little softened. It certainly earned vigorous denials from the president and his own lawyers. David Ignatius at the Washington Post, however, he now reports this, quote, "We're entering a new phase of the Trump-Russia investigation in which the president's efforts to contain the probe are failing. Information he tried to suppress about his business and political dealings is emerging, with more to come." Quote, "A Deutsche Bank subpoena would be especially sensitive. Trump was enraged by a December 2017 report that special counsel Robert Mueller had subpoenaed the bank's records about its dealings with Trump. Quote, the red line apparently held then. Trump lawyer Jay Sekulow told Reuters no Deutsche Bank subpoena has been issued or received." According to Ignatius writing now, quote, "One government source speculates that Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general, blocked any attempt to compel disclosure of the bank's Trump records to avoid getting himself or Robert Mueller fired." That's one government source speculating. I mean, honestly, we don't know if that subpoena ever was issued, or if it did get walked back somehow, and if so, if it did, by whom. But the new phase of the investigation that David Ignatius is talking about here, where he's saying that the president's efforts to, what did he say, to contain the probe are failing, this new phase of the Trump-Russia investigation he's talking about, it's not now one that's happening through the Justice Department. And therefore, it's not one that could be stopped by anyone in the Justice Department. It's not one that would need to be overseen by the brand new Trump-appointed Attorney General, William Barr, who has just started as the new AG. This new phase of the Trump investigation that reflects all these things that the president really doesn't want anybody to look into, they're not happening through the Justice Department. These things are now happening through Congress, where Democrats are now in charge in the House, and where Democrats in the Financial Services Committee started demanding Deutsche Bank records about Trump last year. Actually, the year before that, they started demanding Trump records from Deutsche Bank. Without subpoena power of their own, the Democrats were never able to get any meaningful response from Deutsche Bank. But now they've got subpoena power, and they're going for it. They are finally following that money trail, and it appears that they are the first ones doing it. We know that the Senate Intelligence Committee didn't do it. The Senate Intelligence Committee said they hope that Robert Mueller's doing it. House Democrats say they don't believe that Robert Mueller's doing it. And we saw that fiasco with that reporting that all got walked back and everybody freaked out about from December 2017. If there is a money trail in this story, the first stepping stone down that trail is Deutsche Bank, to at least ask questions there. Nobody's done that yet. But now they're starting. The Democrats in the House are starting, and apparently this may be the red line for the president. Honestly, it feels more like a red flag to a bull that's already loose in a china shop. But that's happening. That is starting now, and the person who's leading the effort joins us next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.